Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana in the US. And today I'm going to talk about the decarbonization of energy. And by that, I just mean reducing carbon emissions that are associated with energy use and energy production, specifically fossil fuel energy production. What I'm going to talk about today are some of the kinds of conceptual barriers to reducing carbon emissions that come with the way that we think about energy. So why is this important? This is important because our current target, according to the UN Commission on Climate Change, is that there should be no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius of overall global warming by 2100. Any more than that, and the outcomes are catastrophic in terms of effects on climate for nations in the global south, especially, and for developing nations most of all. So if we want to achieve at least a 50-50 chance at meeting that goal and making sure that we reduce the overall risks to developing nations, then that goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100 means that we need to be at emissions net zero globally by 2050. Not too far off. And we need to have negative emissions beyond that point, meaning that we need to be able to clean up emissions that we've already put into the atmosphere. And what that means is that for a 50-50 chance at meeting this goal, we need to cut carbon emissions 50 to 65% by 2030. This is a huge amount. So where are emissions coming from? And where are we? Right now, we are at 1 degree of warming overall over the pre-industrial era. This is how much warming has already occurred. Under the Paris Agreement, which is a global agreement to reduce carbon emissions, if every nation meets its goal of reducing their carbon emissions, warming will still reach 2.6 to 3.1 degrees Celsius by 2100. We are not making our targets match our goal. And where those emissions are coming from, this is from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Globally, most carbon dioxide emissions, most greenhouse gas emissions are from fossil fuels, carbon dioxide from fossil fuel production. And fossil energy is the largest contributor to the flow of carbon emissions globally. Right now, what we're seeing is that energy grows by 2% a year globally, but we need it to decrease by 6% per year in order to meet the goals. So you may be asking yourself, if we're talking about climate change and energy, shouldn't we be talking to policymakers? Shouldn't we be talking to scientists? Why send a philosopher to think about this? And I think that that's because how we think about a thing shapes how we think about solutions to that thing. How we think about a problem shapes what we think our solutions could possibly be. So how we think about energy shapes how we think about solutions to energy use. Val Plumwood is a philosopher who said, quote, "In this period of crisis, time taken for the development of theory seems like a luxury indeed. But if we do not understand the development and defects in the Western story of reason and nature, we may remain trapped within it or settle for one of its new versions." Basically, what I want to know is how do our values and our thinking translate into the language of public policy? I think that's important for how we think about what's possible in thinking about solutions to climate change. So I'll give you a brief outline. First, I'm going to talk about how we're currently thinking about energy here in the U.S. and what kinds of statements are made about energy and decarbonization of energy in the U.S. I want to talk about some consequences of thinking like this. And then I'll give you some ideas about how I think we should change our thinking about energy. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about what kinds of things we hear in the U.S. What is the standard narrative that we hear about energy and decarbonization of energy in the U.S.? Well, first, what we hear from our politicians in the U.S. is that decarbonization of energy requires a trade-off between economic prosperity and environmental goals. Basically, what we hear is that if we reduce our carbon emissions by reducing fossil fuel use, that's going to be very expensive and that we can't meet environmental goals without losing economic prosperity. So basically what that leads to is this idea that reducing or eliminating fossil fuel production is going to entail an economic sacrifice, especially by the poor and by American workers. So the idea is that fossil fuels are cheap, and they're widely available, they're easy to use, and if we try to give them up, then we're going to have to buy something a lot more expensive. And the idea is that the poorest of all of us are going to bear the burden of the bill for doing this. And third, what we hear is that without continued fossil fuel production, underdeveloped nations and developing nations will be denied a path to an improved quality of life. So when you think about this, you hear things like, well, without access to cheap fossil fuels, how are underdeveloped nations supposed to, quote, catch up with first world nations? And so this is kind of the narrative that we hear. And generally speaking, these first three claims seem to rest on this more general assumption that economic gains and losses are what ought to guide our decision making about the energy mix. So that what we have to look at is always what kinds of things will profit us and what kinds of things will lose economically in thinking about the energy mix. But I think that there are more ways of thinking about this. First of all, William Freudenberg gives us a framework for thinking about this and points out that when we're talking about the relationship between society and the environment, we often think about it in terms of the disproportionalities of benefits and burdens. So what do I mean by that? Freudenberg argues that rhetoric about sacrificing prosperity to environmental goals legitimizes unequal distribution of environmental rights and resources while making relevant facts about the structure of that disproportionality invisible. So what does this mean? Basically, Freudenberg argues that there are two diversions going on. The first diversion is that there's a disproportionality of benefits and burdens of the fossil fuel system. What we know is that the richest few are disproportionately at fault for carbon emissions. The United States, for example, is 5% of the world's population and is responsible for over 20% of its global emissions. So that means the richest few and European nations and nations in the global north are disproportionately at fault for carbon emissions. The richest few, on the other hand, disproportionately benefit from that carbon pollution. It's not that every single American enjoys an equal amount of economic prosperity because of the cheapness and wide availability of fossil fuels. It's only the richest few that in oil companies, basically speaking, that disproportionately benefit from carbon pollution. In contrast, the poorest are those who are disproportionately at risk from the effects of climate change. Here in the United States, people of color are much more likely to be affected by climate change, much more likely to be affected by pollution. Around the world, people in the global south are disproportionately at risk from the effects of sea level rise, from the effects of droughts, from the effects of extended monsoon periods, and from the extended hurricane seasons. What we know is that the richest few are disproportionately at fault, and they disproportionately benefit from carbon pollution, while the poorest disproportionately are at risk from the effects of climate change due to fossil fuel use. So in conclusion, we do not all benefit equally from fossil fuels, and in fact, the poorest are disproportionately suffering the effects of overuse of fossil fuels. So how is it then that we keep using fossil fuels and we don't change? Well, remember back to the standard narrative in the US. The idea is that fossil fuels are supposed to benefit all of us economically. So if we get away from the fossil fuel system, all of us will have to sacrifice economically to get it. This is Freudenberg's second diversion. It's a distraction. This is a privileged narrative, a narrative that says that everybody benefits equally from carbon emissions is false. But that is a privileged narrative that diverts attention away from those disproportional risks and legitimize it. So what we're seeing is those false narratives tell us that everyone would have to sacrifice equally if we stop using fossil fuels. That's not true. Only the richest would have to sacrifice a great deal to stop using fossil fuels. Part of the reason for this is that everybody in America, for instance, every U.S. taxpayer currently subsidizes fossil fuels to the tune of billions of dollars a year. So there's a narrative that says the U.S. can't give up fossil fuels without giving up a great deal of economic prosperity. But if we stopped subsidizing fossil fuels, if the U.S. taxpayers stopped subsidizing fossil fuels, we could use that money to transition to renewable energy instead. And the only people who would have to sacrifice in a scenario like that would be those who benefit disproportionately from using fossil fuels. Another way of looking at this is that commodities such as oil and gas are protected by commodities markets. In the US, you can hedge your risk in your investments by trading on the commodities market, which is a whole system of side bets on fossil fuels that have nothing to do with the prosperity of the everyday person and everything to do with the prosperity of people who disproportionately benefit from fossil fuels. It's also not true that developing nations see a net benefit from fossil fuels. What we know is that there's something called a resource curse, which is that nations that have a lot of fossil fuel reserves actually have much greater economic inequality within their nations than nations that don't have those fossil fuel reserves. It's not true that developing nations see a net benefit from fossil fuels either, because developing nations are greatly at risk from climate change and are currently already seeing displacement due to sea level rise, are already seeing displacement due to famine, to desertification, and to extended monsoon seasons, extended hurricane seasons. Developing nations are already hardest hit by the effects of climate change that are currently happening, which means that developing nations are not seeing a net benefit from fossil fuels. They're seeing a net negative because of climate change. We also see that overall, the system of fossil fuels supports U.S. currency to the detriment of other currencies. OPEC has agreed since the 1970s to trade oil in US dollars, which means that US dollars are effectively backed by oil. If we were to stop using fossil fuels, this system would collapse and the US dollar would see some instability. This is a problem, and one that the privileged narrative is really trying to protect. So what's the solution? If those who are rich and in power are entrenched in benefiting from fossil fuels, how are those of us who are poor, how are underdeveloped nations supposed to fight this? Well, what we're told over and over is that what we have to do about climate change is to change our individual behavior. You're told you need to walk to work, you need to drive less, you need to fly less, you need to consume fewer fossil fuels. But I believe that changing individual behavior in this case is not going to be a solution. Rather, I think that we should be thinking about the system as a whole. And what I'm using for this is systems thinking by a thinker named Donella Meadows. What Donella Meadows points out is that systems do exactly what they're designed to do. So what does that tell you about how our system of energy is designed? If only the rich benefit from fossil fuel use, then systems doing what they're designed to do, the system must be designed to benefit the richest and not the poorest. So what I think the insight of systems thinking tells us is that if a system is set up to limit your choices, the problem is the system, not your choices. So what do I mean by this? I mean, the system of fossil fuel energy use is set up to limit your choices so that your only choice is to use fewer fossil fuels rather than having a choice between renewable energy and fossil fuels, between locally produced, sustainable and renewable energy systems versus the global petrodollar system. The system is set up to limit your choices, so the problem is the system, not your individual behavior. Even if each and every one of us changed all of our individual behavior, we would still be generating fossil fuel energy. So the problem is the system that limits the choices. Second, if a system is designed to serve people at the top of a hierarchy, changing our behavior, changing the behavior of those at the bottom, is not going to result in changes in the outcome. The system is designed to serve people who benefit from fossil fuel production and fossil fuel use, those at the top of the hierarchy. And who's at the top of the hierarchy? The US dollar depends on the petroleum system. Therefore, I believe that the fossil fuel energy system is designed to serve US hegemony. So I think if we want to change things, if we want to think about how to solve climate change, we have to change the goal of our system of energy. Our goal should not be providing fossil fuels to people cheaply, but it should be accessible, affordable, clean energy services for everyone, locally, sustainable, renewable energy. The goal should not be to serve capital and policy interests. So how is it that our thinking limits our choices and our imagination in this area? Well, my theory is that one of our mistakes in thinking about energy is that we think about energy in what I call the fossil conception of energy, or the FCE. Basically, what I mean by this is that we think about energy as a thing, as a substance that you fill a can with and carry to the area where you need to make energy happen. But energy isn't a thing. Energy is more like a service or a capacity to do work. It's not necessarily something that is supposed to provide profit or capital to those at the top. It can, but if we think about energy as a service, then we can change the goal of the system and flip the hierarchy so that those who are at the bottom are the ones who are served by our system of energy. And I believe that system is more clearly served by locally produced renewable energy through solar and wind. I believe we have to change thinking about energy from how each of us personally consume energy to thinking about the collective interests of our communities. That we have to change our thinking about energy as a commodity. Instead of thinking about it as a commodity to be bought and sold and stockpiled and kept away from people and sold to them, think about energy as a public good, like water, like sanitation, like public health, and like communication. Think of it as a public good that serves everybody rather than interests at the top. And change thinking about energy as something that profits the few to something that empowers the many. My name is Jen Rowland. If you have any questions or would like to see more data or would like to talk to me more about this, my email address is jjrowland@bsu.edu. Thank you for listening.